future historians posing the question, is another world really possible? And our method is a simple one. We're pretending that we live in the year 2117, on the centenary of our day today, and the bicentenary, is that when it's 200 years? Yes, of the Russian Revolution of October 1917. Could you move the mic a little closer, please? So,
by this point, they should have my brain rejuvenated and transferred to a new body. I will be 155.
Right. Well, I hope to be long gone. Oh, good morning, Lola. I'm so glad to see you. Bonjour.
Hey, bonjour.
So, as I was saying, this is our method, and I want to go into it a little more deeply. But first, let's just have a go around. I'm Richard Greenman, the convener. Actually, my role here is that of the dungeon master in a game of Dungeons and Dragons. Only our game is called Future Historians and Then and Now. And next to me,
Dickie Wentz. I'm a writer and a newbie to socialism and Marxism.
Fred.
Switching the camera. Good morning, I'm Fred Murphy. I work with Richard on the technical side of this project as well as much of the content, and that's me.
Well, say a little bit about your background.
Okay, so briefly, I've been working with the Marxist Education Project here in New York for the last 2 or 3 years. Prior to that, I spent some time in a PhD program in historical studies, worked on a dissertation on the formation of the state in Argentina, which was never finished. Hence, I'm a failed academic, or as I like to say, refugee from academia. And prior to that, I spent about 17 years as an active socialist and journalist with stints in much of Latin America, including Nicaragua during the Sandinista Revolution. So that's me. Let's go over to Barry.
Hey. Yeah, well, I'm a washout from the corporate world lately, and been following political, social happenings for the last few decades, and sort of staying in touch with Brian to, with things he's involved in, and it's been increasingly feeling like you need a better vision for the future, and that there was space to create something new, like a new vision, and here I am.
Great.
To see whether there's something I might be able to contribute to such a project.
Thank you. David Schwartzman in Washington, D.C.
Yes, happy to come back. I missed last week due to issues that I had no control. Okay, I'm retired, not retired from a lot of different activities, though. I taught at Howard University for 39 years, and I would describe myself as a Blockian Marxist. Ernst Bloch had a great influence on me very recently. And I'm a biogeochemist and still doing research in the area of how hot was the climate 3 billion years ago? A lot hotter than it is now. That's at least a controversial issue in geoscience. So I'm still involved in that. But with my oldest son, Peter, we have a website which I invite you to look at if you haven't, called solarutopia.org, where we do studies on solarization and societal impact. And my son and I have a book that should be coming out in less than a year, which deals with this subject. So that's my introduction.
David Schwartzman has a long, long history as an activist, both in the Green Party and in the Party for the Freedom for DC statehood.
Yeah.
Also, he's quite recognized as a scientist. His most recent book was published by Columbia University Press, and it's on the origins of life.
No, can I correct you? Not really on the origins of life. It's called Life Temperature in the Earth, and it's about the coevolution of life and the climate, mainly the climate over geologic time. And I've been greatly influenced by Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock, so-called Gaia. I wouldn't call myself a Gaia follower, but okay, that's enough from me. And don't say any more, Richard, about me. Thank you.
Okay. Jason.
Yeah. I work in the subway system. I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and do serious solidarity and other projects. I don't know what else to say right now.
Lola is in Paris and she's joined us for the last 2 weeks. Go ahead, Lola.
Yeah, hi. I'm a social psychology student, and I'm about to do a PhD next year. And I'm interested in collective action and resistance to social movements and sorts of things like that.
Thank you. We got Sam.
Oh.
You're in LA, right?
I am out east of Los Angeles in Claremont. Which is, well, I sort of take care of a farm, very small farm at a college near here, Pomona College, and I donate each week to a food bank in the area, which is kind of a substitute at this point for actually engaging in a food not bombs local, which is what we used to have about a decade ago. And I am writing a book called Utopian Dreaming and Climate Change, which will be hopefully pitched with the help of Jason W. Moore, and which will be somewhat organized so that I can it can be used in English department courses, as well as, you know, in your various courses on critical thinking and on the future and that sort of thing. And so that's what I'm engaged in these days.
So that's everybody that's online. Yes? Yes? Everybody that's online in the studio has been accounted for, I think? Yes? Okay. Among those who are absent are Anya Rabri, who is a Ukrainian student who is right now in Russia. Our two Russian correspondents, Alexei Gusev, a historian, and his partner, Yulia Gusev, who's the translator of Victor Serge and many other anti-Stalinist leftists. Peter Hudis from Chicago, who is a Marxist philosopher, very well known, and his most recent book is, or next to recent book, is Marx's vision of the alternatives to capitalism. And the final person that was here last week but is missing is Harry Halpern, who is a worker in internet technology, an expert on, what is it called? Not cryptology, encryption, among other things. And so we're down to a small group today. Oh, and Jenny Greenman, who is overwhelmed because she's doing 2 jobs plus studying, wanted to announce that after the November 12th meeting, she will be performing in New York City in a cabaret in the afternoon, and everybody is invited.
We're also missing Brian Tokar.
Ah, Brian Tokar from Vermont, who is successor to the Institute for, how do you call it? Social Ecology, founded by Murray Bookchin. Okay, so last week's discussion, now I'm speaking as convener and Dragon Master, I thought was very, very fruitful and ended up with all of us giving some ideas about what a future world might look like. And those are being typed up now, and we'll send them back to you for editing and to put on the wiki. So during this week, I was able to assimilate a lot of the suggestions that were made and kind of try to tighten up and clarify our method here, okay? And so what I mean by Dragon Master is this, Dungeon Master, excuse me, is that my job, obviously getting all the feedback from you and help from you, is to set up the parameters of this voyage so that it becomes easier and easier for you to write the adventure, which is what is done in this Dungeons and Dragons game. And so here's what I've come up with in terms of clarification. What is our goal? What is our end product? Well, our end product is a kind of a book, which is being written collectively on the wiki. And the tentative title of this book is Then and Now. And the way that it's organized is that it presents itself as a textbook, as a school book, to be put in the hands of teenagers in the year 2117 on the occasion of the 200th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and looking back a century to 2017, and explaining to these young people what life was like before the emergence of a new world out of the shell of the old, and how, because that's very important, how we got from the old world to the new world, and not necessarily in great detail, a description of the world that we are living in now, in 2117. So the object of the game when we play it is that we all put on our historian hats. I've forgotten my hat, so I'll put this on my head for a moment. But that we literally play this game. Now, this week, all right, and how is this textbook organized? Well, I think a lot of us have been reluctant to play the game because of the idea of writing a novel, which does not come easily to most of us, perhaps except for Dickie, who was a drama writer. But actually what we're doing is we're writing a history book. In fact, a history textbook, which will be simplified and presented to young people. And the way that this textbook is organized is through a series of topics. So these are the topics that are already in the curriculum, plus a number of other topics which got left out. And we go from topic to topic to topic. And in each topic, we have 3 subdivisions: then, now, and how. And this is how our textbook is structured. Now, once it's written in a first draft, we can kind of smooth it over. so that it isn't so crude that way, but that is basically our method. So in the then, what we're doing, since the rule of this is that everything has to be based on fact or based on plausible extrapolation from history and from verifiable facts, what we do in the then is give a description of what the world is like in 2011. And I've already started doing that. Fred, if you could flash on the screen the one on catastrophes, and read the top line of it. It occurred to me, finally, that instead of trying to make up our heads based on our readings, that simply all we needed to do was basically paraphrase and quote the readings. So that's exactly what I did. We'll soon see it on the thing. All right, this week's category is catastrophes. And since we left out two very important looming catastrophes. One, the collapse of the food system with the death of insects and all kinds of terrible things caused by industrial agriculture and global warming and the like. And we also not dealt with the atomic threat, which along with global warming and food is the other existential threat to the future of life on this planet, and certainly of civilized human life. So all I did was the wonderful readings, many of them suggested by Fred, included this first one by a truth-out journalist called Dar Jamal, yes. So instead of reinventing the wheel, I begin this with saying, a century ago in October 2017, journalist Dar Jamal sadly observed, quote, "The earth is unraveling due to human forced warning." And he goes on. And I quote that paragraph, and then I go on to paraphrase most of his article, cutting out the references to various URLs where you could get the original articles that he's quoting. And the main thing that I did was put all the verbs in the past tense. So the next paragraph begins, "It appeared that deforestation was having twice the negative impact on anthropomorphic, or what is it called, climate change, as previously believed." And then deforestation had two main negative impacts. And it goes on like that. Now, obviously, as we move into the refining of this, you know, we can edit this, we can add new information and so on. And Fred asked the question of rights to these things. First of all, we're fairly quoting and footnoting. And at the end of it says for further study, this is aimed at our teenagers of 2017, go to the original article. And since most of these people that we're quoting from, for example, Dawson a little bit later on, are people who support our cause, and in fact, we're going to try to get Dawson to participate in our future historians thing, we'll definitely get permission. But so that when we suggest our readings, and when we do and post them, we're doing it with a specific focus in mind. Now, we already had the focus of, in terms of the how, and then the that, the future, and the way to get there, of cherry picking only the things that might possibly, if all combined, lead to a better world. And many of us are quite pessimistic. When I originally imagined this project, I for a better world to emerge in the 21st century, we ought to be able to imagine it. And sometimes, like after reading all of the stuff that I put online this week, I moved it up to 1 chance in 1,000. On the other hand, as I've said before, Emmanuel Wallerstein, who is a co-thinker with us, he calls it a 50-50 chance, which is another way of putting it, because it's either going to be one thing or another, either a better world or something a lot worse, with the existential threats at any time for climate chaos to go completely haywire or for atomic bombs to go off. So what I'm asking you to do when you choose the readings, I'm not saying we choose only positive Pollyanna-ish ones. We describe the present as if it were the past. And this has a marvelous transformational effect on our thinking. Just try it. When you excerpts from these writers that we've been reading and put their verbs all in the past tense, they acquire a solidity, a veracity that is quite astonishing. And instead of having the feeling that we are a few minority people crying in the wilderness, okay, and say, but look what's happening to the climate, and everybody else is saying we need more progress and we need more coal and so on. No, we are calm historians, and looking back at all of these things acquire, as I say, a veracity, a solidity. Now, the second thing that we are going to excerpt are the positive things. So in Ashley Dawson's wonderful book, which is called Extreme Cities, there he's got it, I've excerpted quite simply his preface, turning what he has in the present into the past tense. And what he describes there is all of the different ways, New Orleans, to Occupy Sandy, to other places where people have self-organized and stepped up and tapped the innate human capacity for sympathy with each other, for solidarity, to get in and pitch in and organize relief. And this he opposes, as of course the people did, with the top-down so-called relief efforts of governments and hierarchical helping organizations which show up late, have a disdain for the people and their ability to help themselves, turn them into, like Trump is the best example, his gesture of throwing paper towels to a crowd is just epitomizes this attitude, and mainly militarization, as happened in Haiti, as happened to an extent in New Orleans. So when we put those parts in, and as you'll see, I've already started doing it, all we need to do next is extrapolate. That is to say, imagine the kinds of disasters that are already predicted in what we've already said about then, and the kinds of reactions, but seeing them spread. Because the one criticism of all of these self-organized things like Occupy Sandy is that when the emergency was over, they kind of like went back into the woodwork. Mm-hmm. And so what's clear is that if they are going to be effective and change the world, they have to be organized, they have to be linked together, they have to be federated. Basically what we do is that we imagine it, and in last week's internet discussion, we talked about what is necessary to link people up, which is the invention or the development of new kinds of social platforms. Facebook, which is largely recuperated by business and so on, but our own. using encryption if necessary, but enabling us, and such things already exist, and there are examples of it, so that we extrapolate. And then, as far as the now is concerned, that is to say, the world of 2117, I'm beginning to think that we don't need to go into a huge amount of detail, because of course we're talking to an audience, teenagers at 2017, who already know this. So what we're telling them is, of course, you take it for granted that everybody has, let's say, a minimum income, and that we can all have enough to eat and a place to sleep, and so on, and the right to travel, and all of these things. But you should know that 100 years ago, it was not like that. And so we use that kind of rhetoric to make our book credible without having to be totally precise about what kind of world we're hoping will come into being. All right, now, last week, somebody asked me, hey, but where is the main narrative, okay? Because for this to be the kind of narrative that describes how we got from there to here, there has to be some sort of revolution in the middle of it. Okay, some sort of revolution. Well, I'm more and more being purposely, thinking of being purposely vague about it. Already the word emergence, which I think is the correct word, because the word revolution not only scares people, it also suggests for many, many people something that turns and then turns back again. And that indeed has been the result of the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the other revolutions that we know. And it fits in with the cyclical theories of Eastern philosophies and various other things. Emergence is new, and it is scientific. It talks about the coming together in a world of complexity of all kinds of individual efforts that in some way merge in a kind of synergy and produce something new that didn't exist before. So what we're doing to describe this emergence is that we're putting before people all of those elements. That is to say, people organizing themselves, creating their communities, but for this in the process of reconstruction, so that that becomes revolutionary, and of course all the efforts being connected so that it happens on a planetary basis, because that's what is new. What is new is that we've understood that it must be a planetary, and we've brought to it a certain prejudice, which is that it's not likely to happen with a top-down, organized, military-style vanguard party ordering everybody out to do the same thing at the same time. Likely to be, and this is what we're in favor of, because we've seen the results of the taking of power by such organizations, and they end up with corrupt, class-dominated dictatorships. So this is not what we're choosing. This does not correspond to the end result that we hope to project, or that we hope will attract people, because clearly that kind of solution, whether it's like it turned out in Russia and China, or in all the countries of Africa, which started out with humanism and everything and ended up with corrupt military dictatorships. So that we can give a picture of this emergence without being too specific. And the idea of breaking it down by categories, and that they all come together, we refer in one chapter to the other chapter. as we have seen under energy. You know, this made it possible for this to happen. So the chapters refer to each other. They all have this middle part of the how. And the middle part of the how is occupied by an idea of mass emergence. We may even end up using the word swarm, which was put forward by Hart and Negri. Is that not right? And, you know, which may be a good image, although I'm a little bit worried about it because of this whole idea of the hive mind. And my version of the hive mind is planetary consciousness, which I think is philosophically much more tenable. In any case, there are narratives that will be included in the how, under each one of these topics, but they will refer to each other and won't go into detail. So, to summarize, we've got a textbook. It's divided into categories, as many textbooks are in history, okay? These are all parallel stories that are ongoing. And the basic idea is to use the division of then, now, and how to present in the then a picture of the world today that will be accurate, that everyone will recognize, and which they will believe because it's in the past tense. The first thing that this utopia that we're building does is to realize, to help the reader realize that there is no other viable alternative than emergence, than a total transformation of society. The second thing the then does is that it points at the elements in the old society of self-organization and human solidarity and self-help that could conceivably, if brought together on a planetary scale, get us there. And then the third thing it presents in the utopian part is that, as David has shown with solar communism and others with permaculture and so on, technologically speaking, a better world in which there will be plenty for all and no starvation and so on, and no people homeless, and all of this suffering eliminated. It is possible. It glimmers on the horizon. So what I'm asking us to do, what we need to do now, is to start writing. And what I'd like everybody to do, and I'll summarize this in an email that goes out to the people that are absent, is that we prepare for next time contributions to the categories of them, then, now, and how. And Fred and I have decided that we're going to slow down a bit and continue next week with the same readings, because there were far too many readings on catastrophes, but add new catastrophes, that is to say, the atomic one and the collapse of the food system, which is something that we haven't gone into in sufficient detail, okay? So either on the climate or on the atomic or on the food, I would like each person to plagiarize, if you will, and take from the readings elements that describe the catastrophe, elements that point to how people are even now organizing to get out of it, and then extrapolate from that. So what I want you to do is put your name on it, so it'll be Lola or Sam or whoever, and then, you know, a page or two of either write it yourself or summarize what someone says, simply translate it into the past tense, and put it online for us to discuss. Now, Fred and I have discussed this, and I think for the first trial at this. What I want you to do is do it as a doc, okay? Just do it as a doc rather than put it on the wiki in the first instance, for two reasons. One is that I think some people are a little bit shy about exposing themselves on the wiki. And second of all, the doc form enables us during the week to read each other's contributions and to comment on them, because the doc allows us to press on the comments button, and in the margins, and we can even, by the save changes, go in there and add stuff. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that we tear each other's visions apart, okay? This is a place where it's not but necessarily, but and. So we add something to it. Or we ask some questions and ask the author to expand on this, that, or the other thing. I don't want to get us to get into ideological disputes necessarily, but to but to cooperate and to show that there are parallel ways that we can describe how humanity came out of the old world into the new. So put those up online. We've created a new folder inside Catastrophes. The folder is called Add to Wiki. And the form is, as you can see, the one that I just read from, the one that I did to set an example is RG, Richard Greenman, that's me. And then, like where it fits, and then Catastrophes, that's the chapter it fits in. And if you think your thing fits in 2 chapters or anything you want, just identify yourself and where you think it's going to go. We'll have comments on it. We'll discuss and defend and also improvise in our next class. Okay, so that'll give us something to keep busy. And then eventually stick it up on the wiki. So that's, to summarize then, the way that the game, I'm suggesting we play it for a while and improve on it always, is pick choose, we're going to need to do some research and choose stuff about the atomic bomb and also the explosions of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and so on. Show Fukushima, show how people did and could react in a positive way, and the same thing with the food crisis. And then these will be articles which will refine and eventually will join the wiki. So I hope that that works for everybody. Do you want to have a little discussion about it now and ask some questions? These are all experimental things. I think this will be a little easier than trying to improvise out loud the way we did last time, although that wasn't bad. So let's just have a brief go around and ask people what they think of this new way of playing.
I think it's a great idea.
Oh, Barry, I'm really glad to hear that.
And I feel like we need to get more interaction. And if I could, I mean, if I could add one more thing, I think the goal of this unified document is a pretty tall goal, particularly in the time period we're looking at. And so possibility is that, you know, clusters of people could come together to you know, on things that, you know, that they feel they can synthesize and you know, produce smaller syntheses that may be, you know, milestones on the way to where we'd like to be able to go.
That's an excellent suggestion. And actually, in the original syllabus, we had this idea of forming teams of people that had the particular topic. Okay, and I'm glad you brought that up, Barry, because it just so happens that, all right, we think that, who was it that was here? Dan, last week when we went out to lunch, said, you know, Richard, you shouldn't be discouraged. This is a big project, and it's going to take 3 years. Well, I don't think and it might very well be 3 years before this thing is finished and published. But what he was saying is that we've undertaken a huge thing and we need to slow down, which is why we're doubling up on this unit of catastrophes. All right. So, and what the other thing we need to do is plan ahead a little bit. Now, the next meeting after next week is, all right, next week is the 5th, is that correct? No.
No.
The 29th. Okay. All right. On November 5th, it's the non-viability of capitalism. And I'm going to post 2 things. An abridged version of Wallerstein, who describes capitalism as a historically bounded 500-year period, and my own interpretation of Marx and why the revolution didn't come as it was predicted 150 years ago, and why it's got to come, or could come, now in the 21st century. So those are, and among the things that are predictable is another 2008 global crash and a global depression. So as we look forward to that, I would like some volunteers. Alexei! Alexei is online in Russia. Alexei, can you say good morning to us, or good afternoon? I can't hear you. Speak. Hello?
No sound.
Nice. Streams.
Can you hear me? Raise
Yes,
your hand
yes.
if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
You're talking, but we don't hear you.
Okay.
Alexei, I'm
Sorry, sorry for joining you late.
Oh, now I hear you. Keep talking. You can't
Yes,
hear.
yes.
I don't think Alexei can hear us.
I'm going to call
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, good. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Raise your hand if you hear me. No, Alexei is smiling, but he's not raising his hand.
There's like a 3-minute long delay.
Yeah, there, see?
There, I see.
30
Can you
seconds.
hear me now?
It's a 30-second delay. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Well,
We'll have to pick him up later.
okay, so,
Let's see if anyone else had something to. Sorry.
all right, so definitely we're looking for somebody to work on this question of the depression. Could we have a volunteer for that?
The coming depression?
The coming depression and how this will affect, because among the disasters and catastrophes is a collapse of the economic system.
Yeah,
And I think that that is equally predictable with the climate crisis and the food crisis.
Yeah, it's almost necessary for it to happen, right?
It's almost necessary for it to happen. Exactly. Clearly, if capitalism continues to flourish, at least for the benefit of a minority, we're going to be in the same situation. So is somebody ready to work on that one?
Yeah.
All right, Dickie is. But in any case, I want you to gather information. How have depressions in the past affected people, and how have they encouraged people to organize? The first thing that came to my thought was that depressions were characterized here in New York by expelling people from their apartments.
Yeah.
And the tenants organized themselves, and when the sheriff came to put their furniture out in the street. The people came and brought it back in the house and things like that. Okay, and so let's go on. Thank you, Barry, for that suggestion. You don't want to join the, what committee or team would you like to join among the topics that we have?
Well, I'm not sure at this moment.
Okay, so you can think about it. All right, next we've got David.
Who, me?
Yeah.
I'm going to be in Venezuela on November 5th, so I won't be in Access, but I'll look at it in YouTube. I want to comment briefly on something you said about the now, that you said it, and we're talking about 2117. And I put on Wiki, I put my vision, and I was quite specific about a lot of things. I try to be specific. Of course, it's probably 90% wrong, but nevertheless, I think we need to be specific and concrete about what we project for that year, because it's not the reader in that year that it matters. It's the reader when 3 years from now, when the book comes out. And people, I think, need to at least feel some concreteness of what is possible. And I think that's very important, not to be vague, but to be, and we certainly should have different visions of that. And I think that will certainly be part of the final product, that there'll be multiple visions, which would add a great deal to, you know, what we're striving for. So that's what
Thank you, David. I think that's excellent.
Well, I think it's a great, I just want to say that the process that you've outlined today, I really appreciate. I think that will work quite well.
Oh, I'm so glad, because we've been kind of fumbling for how to do this collective writing. It was an inspiration. We knew that's what we wanted. But now we're actually functioning as a real seminar of historians, because basically what do historians do? They steal documents from the past and they put them in their books. And I'm always tempted to sing Tom Lehrer's wonderful song, plagiarize, let no one's work evade your eyes. Just remember why God made your eyes. And plagiarize, plagiarize, plagiarize. Okay. So, and then extrapolate, of course, extrapolate. And you're perfectly right. Where we can be specific, let us be specific. But where we can't, it's perfectly all right to let things slide. Now, who's next there whose microphone is off? Jason. Jason?
I'm here.
Go ahead. What's your take on this new proposition?
I think it sounds very promising overall. I'll need to read your email and think about it. One I did were sort of you said each person would contribute a document. That was.
I can't hear you. Would you repeat that sentence?
You said each person would contribute their own document, then people would contribute on that document?
Exactly. We each, every week from now on, if this works, we'll have homework. You know, write something, stealing and putting in the past tense for the then, and then extrapolating for the how and now, and put it in this new box, which is called Add to Wiki, okay? And David, I'd like you to just copy what you put on the wiki,
okay,
and also put it in there so that we can comment on it. Because frankly, I didn't find it, what you posted.
It was under energy.
What? It's under energy. Okay.
Yeah.
I was looking under something else.
Okay, I'll do that.
All right. We're back to Jason.
I wonder if it might also work to have a document for each topic. Like, I mean, the wiki is supposed to be that, but the wiki for having kind of a sloppy writing and discussion and debate, like with the comments, like maybe if each topic has a central Google document for people to have a back and forth on, might help interaction, or just some way to help interaction on that, like to, yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
I think
Fred's gonna jump in.
In a second.
Fred is going to answer your question.
Okay.
What happened? No sound. Oh.
For answering.
Did you get that, Jason?
No,
Oh. You weren't able to hear?
no.
Just do it live here off of this.
Okay, Fred explained it to you, but I think that, ask the dog. Maybe he heard
Again, again, rather than write directly into the wiki, we will put our writings into the Add to Wiki folder under each topic. And then we will collectively read and work those over and synthesize something out of that that will then finally go into the wiki. And even though the wiki itself is not by any means the final product, it will be the second round after we've kind of been through each of the selections and documents that we put in the Add to Wiki folder.
Is that clear, Jason?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, that's exactly what I had in mind. So this is basically, we're writing rough drafts and putting them forward for discussion and for adding to, and then when we've had the discussion, well, the wiki can be changed all the time. So then we'll put them up, and the wiki will always represent basically as far as we've gotten so far.
And the document that you have already put in the Add to Wiki folder is a model or an example or a template for how.
Exactly. The document that I put in there is a model, okay, of how to steal from others. Lola.
I really like this idea. I think it's great and it's clearer for me now. I really hope I can contribute every week because I'm very busy, but I'll try. And I won't be able to join you next week because I'm traveling. I just wanted to mention that the idea that we're trying to work on, it kind of resembles, because 3 years back, I wrote a book. It never got published. I never sent it anywhere, but it was actually the same basic idea. So I imagined a time in the future, and it was like, I imagine that the world we're now, it's about to undergo some kind of revolution, and people are gonna like separate into two different groups. And my idea was that some people want to persevere in capitalism and they got separate, and others wanted to create like a new society. So they separated themselves from the others. So my book describes those two worlds, and it's in the future, but it goes back to understand the future that I describe. I describe the past as well to understand how we got there. So it reminds me of my own book, what you're saying. And I would be very happy and honored to, like, I wrote it in English as a personal challenge. So obviously it's not really perfect because it's not my language. I don't speak English very well, but so it's not, probably there are some mistakes and everything. But I would be very honored to share it with you if you want, and like have your ideas on it. And I try to imagine a world like a better, like a utopian place. So I think, I don't know, maybe it can contribute to our project somehow.
Lola, this
That
is
would be
so
great.
wonderful. I just can't believe this. Except that well, this whole project, I must say, has come together in a way that is very, very encouraging, in the sense that all of you are people that have invaluable experience and invaluable ideas, and that unlike so many left projects that degenerate into power struggles and into quarrels over fine points of ideology, we're basically cooperating. And this is wonderful. Yes, by all means. Could we, for example, just put it, create a place for it on the wiki and just put it up there?
I couldn't find the wiki earlier. I don't know. I haven't tried again, but I had trouble accessing it the first time. So I don't know if it works, but I can try to put it on Dropbox otherwise.
Okay.
Dropbox is better.
All right, the Dropbox is better, says Brett.
Okay.
Oh, this is wonderful. My gosh. Wow. So you've done your homework for next week, even though you may not be. Is it next week that you can't come, or the week after?
Next week.
Well, wow. This is excellent news. Now, who's next? Sam?
I think Sam's gone. Oh, no, he's back.
Oh, he's muted.
Sam, you're muted. We can't hear you. Sam,
I've been doing other things while you all have been talking, and so I really don't have much to contribute because I haven't been around. There is going to be a chapter in my book titled Margaret Atwood and Dystopia that may have some bearing on your current topic. And I really, at this point, had the intention of just listening in. The last couple of months have been pretty busy for me because DeVry gave me 70 students to deal with, and this should change as of tomorrow when I will have met only 26 students to deal with, and I'll be able to get back to work on the chapter. So I'm kind of late with this particular topic. I'm slow on it, and I don't know, the chapter on Margaret Atwood and Dystopia deals largely with Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy, and is about half finished at this point. So I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know if you've all read the Mad Adam trilogy. It's a good read. It largely, I see some nodding. It concerns a future in which capitalism has morphed into a sort of permanent class structure where there are compounds linked by bullet trains where the elites live and everyone else lives in the plebe lands, which is the land that is left after climate change has swallowed up the coastal areas with the advance of the oceans. And the central action in the book concerns the act of a mad scientist to create a pandemic that wipes out most of the human race and replaces, and the same mad scientist replacing the human race with a new genetically engineered human race. So I don't. That's kind of where I am at this point, and I'm just going to leave it there.
Thank you, Sam. I'd like to make a suggestion to you. A little less overwhelmed by 70 students, which is to use our method and cannibalize your own writing. That is to say, to paraphrase and cut up into the right-sized chunks these things that you've been working on and thinking about for years, and to stick them in the right category, okay? So that we can integrate them, discuss them, and make them part of the readings. Yes, I know that Margaret Atwood trilogy very, very well. And,
oh, good.
And in fact,
it's a fun read.
What?
It's a fun read. She's very much
wonderful, right?
She's very much a fan of Jonathan Swift, which gets involved in the chapter.
Well, her books, like all utopias, has the advantage, first of all, of criticizing the existing society and teasing out where it's going, the tendencies, the negative tendencies within it. And so that becomes very, very satirical. At the same time, her solutions are often a little bit mystical. And the one rule that we have in this seminar is no gods and no extraterrestrials. But much of what she does is grist for our mill. And precisely, I was going to ask Fred now to take over his half of the meeting, since he is the head of the team that prepared the Catastrophes readings. And we're now going to go into the discussion of this week's readings of Catastrophes. And among them, here, I'm giving Fred now the microphone. So, you know, give us a little something to put in that Dropbox to chew on.
Richard?
Okay, one moment. I just want to move the camera. Okay, good morning again. I wanted to start actually by just reading a few excerpts from Extreme Cities, which came out just this week and came out just a little too late for us to include more of it in the in our own readings. But I'm going to make some of this available in a PDF in a day or two.
Actually, what I did is that I copied the introduction, which summarizes the book.
Yeah, and I did post
it in the past tense, and it's part of what I posted in the afternoon.
Right. So this is just a few pages from his chapter called Disaster Communism. And just actually, and back up just for a second, suddenly the notion of disaster capitalism was introduced by Naomi Klein, of course, a few years ago, and summarized very well the way in which the capitalist powers and capitalist enterprises swoop down on situations where catastrophes have occurred and make use of the chaotic situation in order to expel people from their livelihoods or to further, shall we say, primitive accumulation, or to acquire more resources and acquire more assets and generally wreak havoc. But suddenly this week, I just began to see in several different places references to disaster socialism, disaster communism, disaster justice as a riposte and a response to disaster capitalism. And of course, this chapter in Extreme Cities really captures that and addresses it and titles the chapter Disaster Communism. So he says, Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy showed that urban disasters deepen the grooves of already existing social inequality. The stories of post-disaster initiatives such as Rebuild by Design in New York, which was a design competition sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, demonstrate this dynamic anew. Disasters afflict communities that are highly stratified by neoliberal capitalism, which has generated increasingly yawning inequalities and stark vulnerabilities over the last 3 decades. While often invisible to insulated economic elites, this slow violence is rendered visible in the drowned buildings, floating bodies, and abandoned populations that surface after disaster strikes. Exploiting the shock created by such disruptions, what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism, commandeers the rebuilding process to direct state and private aid while further starving an already emaciated public sector. But people who also tend to discover a sense of collective purpose and solidarity in the midst of disaster. Rather than provoking selfish, antisocial, and even belligerent behavior, evidence suggests that even under extreme circumstances, most people tend to regain their self-control and become concerned about the condition of those around them relatively quickly. And he cites Rebecca Solnit's wonderful book, A Paradise Built in Hell, which explains how disasters momentarily suspend the established social order, generating fluid situations in which people often, if not always, react with empathy, care, and heroic concern for one another, rupturing the solipsism that is relentlessly encouraged by capitalist culture. Disasters can often further strengthen capitalism and profit the rich, but they can also offer a glimpse of what radical political theorist Jody Dean calls the communist horizon, the sense that the oppressive conditions of the present can be overcome and new forms of solidarity discovered. Capitalism no longer seems the only possible future. We may even begin to enact a different society based on human empathy and mutual aid. And he goes on at some length in those terms. And again, I will put at least some of those excerpts from that chapter up for folks to read. But I would suggest that everybody get, if they can, acquire a copy of the book. It's online at Verso Books. There's also some ebook editions of it for, I think, $9.99 for all the different ebook platforms. So that kind of segues to our first reading on the list, which was this set of 3 essays from libcom.org called Disaster Communism. And kind of the problematic that these documents, these writings address is, on the one hand, as Solnit and Dawson refer, and as we see examples of in some of the other readings about Puerto Rico and Syria, people in extreme situations often do begin to develop practices and institutions of mutual aid and mutual self-support and self-organization in the absence of any effective response by the authorities. And that is what this author characterizes as disaster communities. These are often, and in most cases, short-lived. So what is the course that is required to achieve disaster communization and create durable institutions and durable and extended practices and possibilities that go beyond just the moment immediately after the disaster. And that is a problematic that is, to be determined, but is something that we can begin to think about as a part of the emergence of more robust and durable practices and institutions that supersede and move beyond capitalist social relations. And indeed, as I was commenting to Richard last night, it may be that the year 2017 is or has been, still is, the year in which masses of people begin to wake up to the fact of climate change and the potential for disasters resulting from climate change, as we've seen in Houston, the Gulf Coast, Miami and Tampa, Puerto Rico most dramatically, India even perhaps more dramatically with the huge floods that happened there earlier this year. The immense wildfires that have been plaguing Northern California. All of these things may come together to provoke a new planetary consciousness, if you will, of climate change and of the consequences of climate change and of the need to begin to address it in more serious terms than the capitalist rulers have managed to do. So let me stop there perhaps and take any comments or questions or elaborations of this general point, and then maybe we can go to some of the specific cases. I know Jason had prepared a few remarks about Syria. I could take up some of the Puerto Rico readings, and any takers on that? We have actually, Richard and I are the only ones left in our New York studio. Dickie had to leave, and a number of our other folks, as Richard mentioned before, are absent. So it's really up to the online participants to join in and have something to say at this point.
Jason, are you there?
I'm here.
I'm there. I'm there.
I am mute.
We don't see you yet.
I think Jason likes to keep his camera off.
He does?
Apparently.
Jason, we can't see you. Or hear you, apparently.
Well, Fred, anyway, I'm listening to what
Barry.
Yeah, I thought that was a good introduction to the topic. I was hoping to hear more. And the Rebecca Solnit book sounds very interesting, let's say.
Can we get Jason to come in here? Jason?
I'm here.
Oh, go ahead, talk.
I mean, I was gonna hold off till if people wanted to do the Syria thing in particular.
No, we're waiting for your report on Syria and people's self-organization in the face of disaster.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that's what you wanted right now. Okay.
Yeah, Jason, we didn't mean to put you on the spot, and I thought there might be some more conversation about the points that I raised, but we can proceed with Jason once he gets back online, because we just lost him apparently. Meanwhile, anyone else?
Rebecca Solnit book, it sounds very, very good. And Barry, why don't you get a copy and excerpt some great passages from it? And
hello?
Add to Wiki.
Yeah, well,
hello?
Jason, please continue.
Jason,
yes,
go.
Okay, Jason, as I was saying, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but as long as no one else has anything to say, I think it would be good if we did move on to the Syria piece of the conversation.
That's fine. Yeah, when I was switching to my notes, I closed the window on it, the Google Hangout window, and dropped out for a minute. Sorry about that. But okay, I mean, I'll try to keep it brief, and then people can ask for more details, and I might have them. Sort of one of the first structures in the Syrian Revolution was coordinating committees, which was simply different. It just started off spontaneously, and so then different activists met each other at protests, wherever, and formed coordination committees to coordinate the different groups or individuals. Then, sort of at the same time, a Syrian anarchist, Ammar Aziz, who was later killed by the regime, put out a call to form local councils, which would be non-hierarchical, self-organized committees to take over the functions of the state. And, especially in 2012, either the regime withdrew from areas or they were forced out. And still to this day, dozens, if not hundreds, of councils are organizing education, justice, humanitarian aid, and everything the state would have to do, and this in the condition often of being both sieged and bombed from the air. Here's a link to the call for local councils. The specific document that was shared was about just one city in which a nonviolent campaign forced a reactionary armed group to devolve some control to a local council. That also has happened in other towns in Syria in the last year, especially this summer. I don't think that last link I sent works, but it can be Googled for. There's an article in the New Yorker too, which, so like one thing people would often probably ask is, what about specialized knowledge? So like medical and surgery is an example. And the New Yorker article goes into like how like Doctors Without Borders and other NGOs have gone there, and when they work in the hospitals, one thing they do is install camera systems. So when they're not there, local medical workers can Skype with them, or they can show them pictures to ask them what to do. And they've actually like done complicated surgeries by text or Skype that like the local medical workers have not like been able to be trained on. Like, so even things that are like highly technical, people can evolve mutual aid solutions. One would prefer not to have to do it that way, but they're even have like come up with different surgical techniques based on the lack of supplies or medical training suited to the specific situation that they're in. There's a recent article on food sovereignty. And so like there's some organic farming projects, not based on sort of a abstract commitment to organic farming, but just on that chemical inputs and GMO seeds rely on external sources and money that they don't have. So they're doing organic techniques that they can do with the materials and surroundings that they're in to increase food production, which is not just a survival strategy, but is a political strategy, because one of the key strategies of Assad is called Kneel or Starve, where he besieges areas to try to force them to surrender by cutting off food. So developing food production strategies that increase yield and don't rely on too much on external inputs is like a political act there. There's also the famous white helmets, which is often conceived of as a humanitarian project, but is also a political project in the sense of not party politics, but is how people thought they could best contribute to civil society and resistance by, going into bombed out buildings and pulling people out and rescuing them. So there's a whole lot of this stuff going on in Syria out of necessity, but also political strategy. And so a lot of it isn't compiled in English, and I've been trying to do that, but it's hard to do. But yeah, so that's a sort of a basic overview, and people can ask questions now or over email if they want to ask for more information.
Okay, any comments or questions on Jason's presentation?
Still looking over those links he sent.
Yeah, Alexei has his name. Okay, be patient with Alexei, because there is a lot of latency, a lot of delay and jitter in his connection. But hopefully, Alexei, we can hear you. So take it away.
Talk, Alexei.
You need to unmute your mic. Alexei, you are muted. We cannot hear you.
One moment.
Okay. Go. No? This is so sad. I don't know why this is happening. Okay.
Now my microphone is on. Okay. So my question for Jason is how can we use the word communism to the situation in Syria? really something related to communism in the classical sense of the word, or it is just an emergency cooperation, self-organization, but it depends on the conditions of emergency. Emergency disappear, created under these emergent conditions, also can disappear. All the structures developed under such crisis situations.
I think I got most of that question. And I think it's a very good one, because I think that, I mean, it could be we could have hours of discussion about this, but from reading a lot about it, like people that are there or have been there, I think it's very stable in the sense of like Trotsky with the question of permanent revolution in Russia. He gave the example of to the argument that this had to be a socialist revolution. He said, well, what will happen if the workers overthrow the Tsar and then they're on strike and the government stands against them? And if you ask that question about Syrian revolutionaries that I've read about, say they don't think in terms of, most of them aren't thinking in terms of Marxism. So that is true. But imagine that they're like the bombs stop and the killing stops, and so that's the question. The emergency is lifted. From what I've read, I can't imagine that the people that have been through that experience would allow a factory owner to mistreat them in the way that they were being, mistreated before the revolution. So they're not thinking, they might not have read Marxism, but not be thinking in terms of Marxism, but in terms of the trajectory of social struggle. It's not just, it's much, they're consciously insane. They're fighting for freedom in general. So while we as Marxists may want to clarify what that means in terms of class society, I think that experience points toward a utopian or communist project. And just to refer back to the first link, that it was a Syrian anarchist that consciously put out this proposal that is now how most of the areas are organized according to, now how far they can go just in terms of the dire straits they're in is a question, how is it truly non-hierarchical? But in terms of once the emergency is lifted, to me the indications are they'll continue to try to self-organize for freedom and not for capitalist profit making.
It's too bad.
Jason, I wondered. Okay, Barry?
Yeah, it's too bad Brian isn't here, because the ISC has been very interested in what's been happening in Syria and following it very closely. And the PKK leader, has a Stalinist convert to sort of Bookchin anarchism, libertarianism, which seems to have very strongly influenced what's happening on the ground. So I think it is very notable, not necessarily, in terms of the utopian situation per se, but I guess it fits into the disaster situation, but how a vision of a way to organize society can be very effective in a true disaster, amazing disastrous situation. Total failure of overlapping state hierarchies.
Alexei, does that satisfy you? A Russian gesture. Alexei, since we have such problems with communication right now, last week, at the end of the session, you said that you wanted to do something, and I'd like to urge you maybe to put in writing, don't worry about the English, but to put in writing some of your ideas and post them on the Add to Wiki folder so that we can have the advantage of your viewpoint. And while I have the floor, I'd like to add this. The Syrian experience is so crucial, partly because it's been so obscured, and particularly on the so-called left, which slanders and simply ignores or wipes out the actual experience of the Syrian revolution. But also, it represents such an extreme situation that the persistence of self-organization and of nonviolent resistance that is successful against the most ruthless and fanatical of enemies is truly remarkable. And I would like to appeal to Jason to write up this and put it in the box for Add to Wiki. And there are several headings. We have a category called violence, nonviolence, which comes up later. And this is a good place to remind people when we get to that of the Syrian experience. And also even what we're coming to, the food question, which is what we're going to deal with next week. If you could extract and extrapolate from that, from how they managed to do something about feeding themselves under these dire conditions, this seems to me excellent evidence for what we're trying to do here. And finally, what is missing so far, not by intention or by plan, but by happenstance, is more representation of what's happening in the non-European, non-white world. And so among the other things that Fred and I are thinking about as we kind of spread out the topics and expand on them is, after we've gone through this first set, to have weeks devoted to different regions: Latin America, the Arab and Middle Eastern world, the Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. And we actually do have people that promise to participate and who are capable of talking about these things in each one of these categories. So we'll have to continue to get them to participate. And my idea is not so much that we want to deal with them separately. We're forced to for purposes of gathering information, it seems to me. But when we've got that information, the idea is that we would have the different categories within that. So it's Latin America, and then Latin America capitalism, Latin America catastrophes, and so on and so forth. And then we integrate into the main narratives then and now the experience. And for instance, in this particular category, we have an excellent article about India, flooding and disasters in India, and we could go right ahead and integrate that right now.
I'd like to ask Jason make a comment on Jason's presentation. I was struck by his description on how organic agriculture kind of blossomed because of the cutoff of the conventional. And I witnessed, of course, we know this happened in Cuba. That's how they moved to agroecology, precisely because of the fall of the Soviet Union, and they had to grow food without fertilizer and so forth, artificial fertilizer. And so I thought that was quite interesting as kind of maybe generalized phenomena that a prefiguration of, you know, the future agriculture. I actually went to on a Food First tour in June with my oldest son in Cuba, and saw the agroecology blossoming, actually, along with cooperative ownership. So some of our old views about 20th century socialism being a complete disaster, I think we should rethink some of that. Not that a lot of it was a disaster.
David, I hope that you will write that up for next week, that Cuban experience. It just fits in right perfectly with the food crisis catastrophe that we'll be dealing with.
Absolutely. Oh, and I also want to say, Jason, that you said you joined you're a member of DSA, right? I joined in December. Myself, I always thought DSA was too moderate, but I see it being real radical now. And, you know, I went to the regional convention yesterday, and it was announced there are 1,100 members now in the greater DC area alone. 1,100. It's amazing. Okay.
Great.
What do you know? Okay, let's switch back to me. Statistically here, Richard and I are on different sides of the room, so it's we're set up for a group of people that are not actually here. So I think now we could. Does anyone want to discuss the Puerto Rico readings? I mean, it really they kind of speak for themselves. I don't really need to elaborate, but it is definitely another situation in which just as Syria, people are self-organizing in the face of tremendously difficult situation, tremendous disaster, lack of electricity, roads being closed, the authorities not incapable of responding effectively, and it's definitely something that bears watching in the coming weeks to see how people continue to respond in that situation. The other thing we wanted to do today, and it's a little tangential, but not really, there were a couple of readings that we put up about geoengineering. And of course, geoengineering is a quintessential capitalist and response to the crisis, to catastrophe, to try to find some high-tech technical fix for climate change or other situations in which money can be made and things can go on more or less as they have gone on, with a reduction of some of the more drastic consequences, but also unintended consequences that can result very readily from messing around with the Earth system in ways that are likely to be inimical. I know David had responded online to Ian Angus's critique of the Jacobin issue. And so I'd like to just turn to David and see if you had some further thoughts or comments on that whole side of the equation.
Actually, I uploaded the two responses to Ian Agnes's review of this special issue of Jacobin that we're talking about. And so, you know, I'm just going to address the geoengineering part. I think it's true that Peter Frey's is it's really referring to Peter Frey's contribution, where he talks about geoengineering. What I think it's a valid criticism that Peter did not sufficiently critique what you just mentioned, Fred. But he did emphasize that any kind of, quote, geoengineering, we can't trust the capitalists to do it, number one. Secondly, he kind of put it in a broader a concept. When he talks about geoengineering, he really was referring, he was putting forward the idea that humanity now actually has an inevitable influence on the globe, on the biosphere. We can't subtract that. We can manage it. And so he gave an example of, restoring forests as being an example of geoengineering. So he's putting it in a broader sense. It's not, but I, of course, share the critique of schemes like solving climate change by injecting sulfate aerosols and so forth. This kind of alteration of the climate. However, I want to reemphasize there is one form of geoengineering I think that will be imperative, because the atmospheric CO2 is now above 400 parts per million, and the safe level by the best climate science is probably below 350 parts per million. So we have to actually draw CO2 out of the atmosphere. We've had a discussion of this in previous sessions. One important way of doing it is agroecology, changing the mode of agriculture so more carbon that's drawn down in photosynthesis is actually stored in the soil. But the effect of inevitable warming is actually to make that mode less effective. And that's what recent research shows, that even with slightly more warming, the soil that capacity will be reduced. So we need some form of industrial scale sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere. And I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about clean coal, okay? About continuing to use fossil fuel and then limit the amount of CO2 released. So I felt that Ian Agnes's critique was inaccurate. I didn't find in that issue any support for nuclear power, by the way. I would invite people to actually read that issue of Jacobin and judge for yourself. So I felt, I'll just conclude by saying that to label that issue as eco-modernist, which I take as the view that under capitalism, just technology will save us, I think is inaccurate. So that's my comments on that, that particular aspect.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with you for what it's worth. I would say that the one author in that issue, Lee Phillips, is pretty notorious for defending and supporting and advocating nuclear power. So he did not do that in the issue, but he is definitely someone who's on record as supporting it. But be that as it may, I know Richard had some ideas about the how to deal with this debate. Were pretty useful.
Well, I don't think that we need to get sidetracked in a polemic with contributors to Jacobin magazine, because it would be a distraction from our project. And clearly, in the vision we have of reconstruction, of post-capitalist reconstruction, and also of what can be done now to slow down and combat the effects of global warming, there have to be massive things like reforestation, like ending the wasteful and disgusting industrial agriculture and replacing it with permaculture and various other, let's call them more organic ways of, you might call it geoengineering, but on the other hand, what appalled me and Fred too, because we went to the meeting of Jacobin, is it seemed to me the concentration on massive techno fixes as the solution, or the main solution, and the absence in the issue and in the discussion that we attended of a sense of identity or connection with our climate justice movement and eco-socialist movements that have, after all, have been very, very active with a magazine like Capitalism, CNS, what does that stand for? Capitalism?
Nature and Socialism.
Oh, Capitalism, Nature and Socialism, and various other things. They seem to be in a total disconnect with that. But put that aside. What impressed me in this polemic, and I'm very sad to say this, is the realization that techno fixes and massive interjections of into the atmosphere are inevitable. Now, I say this with great regret and with total awareness of the very bad side effects that they have. But unless revolutionary emergence happens within a very short time, if the capitalist state system remains dominant, inevitably, one country or another, be it China or the United States or Russia, one corporation or another, be it Monsanto or whatever you will, they are going to attempt something. And what they're not going to attempt is cutting back carbon emissions, because they're totally invested in carbon. Their holdings, the value, are what are called imprisoned assets?
Stranded assets.
Stranded assets. Oil, if we say leave it in the ground, oil and coal, the moment that that becomes effective, the value of oil and coal, which is the value of their great fortunes, simply disappears. So they're not going to do that. And the logging industry itself and the hamburger industry in Brazil is going to stop any attempt to save the existing forests, much less reforest. So we can see that they're not going to go the organic, gentle route. They're going to allow climate chaos to increase to the point where it affects them, where it affects them in their gated communities and where it affects their investments. For instance, going back to these desperate cities, what does he call it again? Extreme cities. New York real estate is one of the places where the billionaires invest their money by buying apartments that they never even visit. It's simply a place where value is stored. And when the water rises up and hurricanes like Sandy become more and more routine, and of course they're not really going to invest in any kind of protections. It took us an hour to get down here on the subway because they can't even maintain the subway, which is over a century old. And they're not even fixing the tracks. I know Jason does a good job in his field, but there aren't enough Jasons out there because they don't want to pay them. So we're in this situation where it's not going to go gently. And when New York real estate begins to collapse and various other things that they own begin to collapse, they are going to do it, whatever it is. They're going to send up mirrors, or they're going to do something to lower the temperature. And these are fairly well-known forms of activity. We know that going back centuries, when there's a big volcano that releases into the air smoke and debris, which filters sunlight so that it comes through less strong, that the temperature goes down. And this has caused disasters in climate change, like what was called the Little Ice Age in on the cusp of the 17th and 18th centuries. That was the reason why the colony in Jamestown nearly perished. Indians the Native Americans were freezing during that period. So they're just going to do it, whether it's China, and in fact, they're doing it already. Among the readings today is some sort of rich guy who has decided that he's going to increase fishing, and that's going to be one of the big topics next time, how the oceans are being destroyed and the coral reefs where the fish breed and so on, so that overfishing, there'll be no food out of the ocean, which is a main source of protein for a lot of people. So they're going to throw sulfur in the water or whatever it is, they're already doing it. And so the question comes to us as future historians who have a duty to history, because we really are serious historians. We need to account for this. We need, in our narrative, to show how this took place under capitalism and how post-capitalism it's dealt with in a different way. But thinking clearly, I don't know how we can avoid the conclusion that with the acceleration of climate chaos, and according to what I used to call humorously the Greenman curve, which I invented in 1997. And the Greenman curve is very simple. Whatever the outside and extreme predictions of serious scientists about the progression of climate chaos is, that the next time they have a prediction, it's going to be worse. That is to say, it's accelerating. It's not just growing, it's accelerating. It's not just an arithmetic progression. It is a geometric progression leading fairly inevitably to a tipping point where it is completely out of control.
Richard,
Now, let me just finish one sentence and then I'll turn it over to you.
let me respond.
I know I'm being controversial and provocative and I'm doing it on purpose. Okay? So if we're going to be faithful to our own oath as scientists in the future, we got to consider the possibility that there won't be any historians in 2117, unless there is some kind of massive intervention sometime between now and then. There just isn't enough time under capitalism for the organic methods to take hold. Now, David, please convince me that I'm wrong.
Listen, I think what you've outlined is a possible scenario. I agree, that could happen, but it's not inevitable. That's where I differ with you. And what it's contingent on is the development of social movements and their merger and their transnationalization and so on. That's what's key. So what you've outlined is, I put that in my 4 scenarios for 2050. That's one possible scenario. But what I take of what you just said, that this is inevitable, this is the only scenario, I reject that. I reject that. And particularly what it comes down to is again, we go back to the argument that only if we have socialism can we solve the climate issue. Well, hello, we have to engage in struggles to push what is possible under capitalism. And we have to be thinking concretely about strategies that are based on a multi-dimensional class struggle and transnational class struggle that could force a different path. And we cannot pretend that this path can only start in post-capitalism. We have to start it now. That's where I think, for the purposes of making a challenge to us, I appreciate what you just outlined, Richard. But don't pretend that this is the only inevitable path.
I think Richard and I were talking about this last night also, and I think the conclusions we reached was that the capitalists are likely to try to do something, and that either it will work, quote unquote, to the extent that it mitigates some of the worst aspects of climate change. And even if it does, it will have drastic negative consequences for working people around the world in other ways, because these things tend to have unintended consequences and tend not to respect the precautionary principle. And so that as those consequences, both good and bad, unfold, people will again respond, as we've discussed in other situations, respond through resistance, self-organization, efforts to mitigate the worst consequences for themselves, and that can hopefully contribute to the emergence of a post-capitalist and just social order. So I don't think we disagree with David. I don't think David is going down I think David's going down the right direction with this, and I think it's just with the addendum or the caveat, at least, that we can expect some of the capitalist powers to attempt various kinds of geoengineering and technical mitigation. I know Sam has things to say about climate change, quote unquote, mitigation, which is not really mitigating anything. So I'll give Sam the floor for a few minutes.
Right. Fred's referring to my paper, Climate Change Mitigation in Fantasy and Reality, in which the current climate change idea, the dominant idea of climate change mitigation, according to the various corporations and corporate governments that are trying to attempt this sort of thing, is ruled basically by the ideology of commodity fetishism, and that they're not really going to be able to accomplish anything of significance, because their real interest is in maintaining this picture of a world as a collection of commodities. Okay, and I think this applies also to what we might see in the future as regards climate change mitigation and as regards geoengineering. Did you all read Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything, specifically the chapter on Sir Richard Branson, and the idea that the capitalists are not going to be able to deal with the climate change mitigation or the climate change problem? They're not going to be able to mitigate climate change simply because they can't maintain their interest in the problem for long enough to actually do something effective about it. And Klein uses the example of Sir Richard Branson, that most concerned of capitalists, the fellow who owns Virgin, right? And that Klein points out, well, okay, he said some interesting things about how he could use his great wealth in order to mitigate climate change, but then when it comes to time to do something about it, well, he's just not really all that interested. He would rather make profit with his money. That's his real main concern, and that climate change mitigation, you know, probably even in the worst of times, will be way, 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 way down on the list of priorities, you know, because after all, profit is the main priority for these people. So that's what I have to say.
I agree, David, absolutely with you, but one quibble, okay? I think clearly that the development of a climate justice movement and a massive intervention to stop capitalism from polluting is the only way to fly. And I certainly didn't want to propose that we wait for socialism before we do anything about it. The way we will get there is when planetary consciousness becomes so powerful that people everywhere faced with floods and food shortages and epidemics and all of these other disasters realize that no help is coming from on high except militarization and not aid, and that the only way to survive is to organize and eventually to link together on a planetary scale. So we're definitely together with that. When I use the word inevitable, maybe it was a bad choice of words, it was because I realized reading these articles that they're already doing it. The guy that's putting sulfur in the water to get more fish so that he can make a profit. And so I agree with you, Sam, completely, but when their profits are threatened, for their continued extraction are threatened, they're not going to stop the extraction, they're going to try to do away with the symptoms. And I don't think we can stop them. So in terms of future history, what kind of imaginary scenario would take care of both of our preoccupations? Maybe one in which they try something and it sort of works a little, but at the same time, it produces side effects that are so horrendous that becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back, and people organize and finally do away with capitalism. It's now 1 o'clock, which for once we're going to end on time before half the people have gone away. But this is going to be a continuing discussion next week as we add other disasters to our list of catastrophes, and we also try to do some writing. So let's explore this with our future historians' hats on and see what kinds of pictures we come up with in that Add to Wiki Dropbox. And thank you, everybody, for continuing to discuss. And Alexei, I think for the moment, the best thing you can do is work with Fred to improve your hookup or move someplace else where you can get a better hookup. In the meantime, write something so that we can know what you think. Fred, would you close the meeting and say something? You're the chair today.
Okay, in my official capacity as chair, and it being Sunday morning, or at least Sunday, blessings on you all, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Bye, everyone.